Imagine, America is being built by people who, just yesterday, were sold at auction. They chase the continent's finest warriors, ride written-off horses, and are fed rotten meat, all in the name of a country that hates them. They were men who, just months before, had been listed in ledgers as property. They were the Buffalo Soldiers. They handed these men rifles left over from the war. They gave them horses that were crippled and old, the cast-offs that the white cavalry units refused to ride. They fed them beef that was often rotting and hardtack that was infested with weevils. And then they sent them to the most inhospitable, dangerous, and terrifying corners of the American map. They sent them to the staked plains of Texas. They sent them to the scorching deserts of Arizona. They sent them to fight the Apache and the Comanche, warriors who were widely considered the greatest light cavalry the world had ever seen. The government expected them to fail. Many white officers refused to command them, calling them brunettes and moke soldiers, claiming that former slaves lacked the intelligence and the spine to face the terrors of the West. General George Custer, the golden boy of the Army, famously refused a command in the Ninth Cavalry, viewing it as a career-ending humiliation. But the Ninth and 10th Cavalry didn't fail. They became the most effective, disciplined, and feared fighting force on the frontier. They rode into the Valley of Death not for glory, but for a paycheck, for dignity, and for the right to be called men. But before we saddle up and ride into the desert with them, I have a question for you. These men patrolled a frontier that stretched from the Mexican border to the Dakotas. They built the America we know today. I want to know where you are watching this history unfold from. Whether you are in London, New York, Johannesburg, or a small town in the middle of the desert, drop your city in the comments below. Let's map out our own territory in honor of the men who mapped the West. To understand the Buffalo Soldiers, you have to understand the paradox of their existence. Why would a black man, newly freed from the horrors of slavery, sign up to wear the uniform of the government that had allowed his enslavement for centuries? Why would he agree to go west and fight Native Americans, another oppressed group, on behalf of a white expansionist empire? The answer lies in the harsh reality of 1866 America. For a formerly enslaved man, freedom was often a death sentence. There were no jobs. There was no land. The South was burning with the rage of Reconstruction, and the Ku Klux Klan was rising. A black man in the South could be lynched for walking on the wrong side of the street. He was destitute, uneducated, and hunted. The Army offered something that no plantation and no sharecropping farm could offer: a life. It offered $13 a month. It offered a roof, even if it was a leaky tent. It offered food, even if it was rotten. But most importantly, it offered the blue uniform with the brass buttons. In the 19th century, that uniform was a shield. It was a symbol of federal authority. When a black man put it on, he was no longer boy. He was a soldier of the Republic. It was a transaction. Give us your body and your life, and we will give you a shred of dignity. So they came. They walked off the plantations and into the recruiting stations. Many were illiterate, signing their enlistment papers with an X. They were physically scarred from the lash. But they were tough. They were men who had survived the Middle Passage's legacy, who had survived the cotton fields, who had survived the Civil War. The desert held no terror for them because they had already lived through hell. The regiments were formed in New Orleans and Fort Leavenworth. The 9th Cavalry was commanded by Colonel Edward Hatch. The 10th was commanded by Colonel Benjamin Grierson. These white officers were outliers, men who believed that black troops could fight, but they faced an uphill battle just to get their men equipped. The Quartermaster Corps, infested with racism, sent the Buffalo Soldiers the worst of everything. When the white regiments got new Spencer repeating carbines, the black regiments got old, single-shot Springfield muskets from the Civil War. When the white regiments got fresh horses from Kentucky, the black regiments got the condemned horses, animals that were lame, blind in one eye, or too old to run. They were set up to be a laughingstock, a dumping ground for the Army's trash. But the men of the 9th and 10th Cavalry had a secret weapon. They had nowhere else to go. In white regiments, desertion was a massive problem. A white soldier, tired of the heat and the discipline, could slip away in the night, move to a mining town, change his name, and start over. A black soldier could not. There was no place in America where a black man could easily hide or find a better job. As a result, the Buffalo Soldiers had the lowest desertion rate in the entire U.S. Army. They stayed. They polished their old rifles until they gleamed. They nursed their crippled horses back to health with a tenderness they had never been shown themselves. They drilled in the mud and the dust until they moved like a single organism. They turned their hand-me-down regiment into an elite unit through sheer force of will. And then they were sent into the fire. The western frontier in the late 1860s was a war zone that makes modern combat zones look organized. It was a vast, lawless expanse of rock and cactus where death could come from anywhere. There were bandits. There were Mexican revolutionaries crossing the border. And there were the indigenous nations, the Apache, the Comanche, the Kiowa, the Cheyenne, who were fighting a desperate, brilliant war for their own survival. The Buffalo Soldiers were tasked with the impossible. They had to patrol thousands of square miles of empty desert. They had to protect the stagecoaches carrying mail and gold. They had to guard the railroad crews, building the tracks that would unite the nation. They had to string telegraph wires so that New York could talk to San Francisco. Basically, they were the infrastructure of the West. Without them, the expansion of the United States stops dead in its tracks. But their primary mission was to engage the Native American warriors. And this is where the name comes from. The origin of Buffalo Soldier is a subject of legend, but the most accepted story is that it was given to them by the Comanche or the Cheyenne. The native warriors, who respected bravery above all else, saw these black men fighting. They saw their fierce, relentless nature. They saw their dark skin and their curly, woolly hair, which reminded them of the buffalo, the sacred animal of the plains. They called them Buffalo Soldiers. It was not a racial slur. It was a title of immense respect. The buffalo was strong. The buffalo was tough. The buffalo fought until it died. To be named after the buffalo was to be recognized as a worthy adversary. The soldiers wore the name with pride. They even put the buffalo on their regimental crest. To understand the war the Buffalo Soldiers fought, you have to forget the forests of Europe or the jungles of Vietnam. You have to imagine a landscape so flat, so vast, and so utterly devoid of landmarks that early Spanish explorers had to drive stakes into the ground just to find their way back, giving it the name Llano Estacado, the Staked Plains. It sits on the border of Texas and New Mexico, a tableland of hell spanning 30,000 square miles. There are no trees. There are no hills. There is only an endless ocean of grass, baking under a sun that feels less like a celestial body and more like a physical weight pressing down on your skull. In the summer, temperatures soar to 110 degrees. Water is a myth, and in this cauldron, the Buffalo Soldiers were ordered to hunt the greatest light cavalry force in human history, the Comanche. The Comanche were the lords of the plains. They called themselves Numunu, the people. They were masters of the horse, capable of riding circles around standard cavalry units, shooting arrows from under the necks of their ponies at a full gallop. They knew where the hidden springs were. They knew how to disappear into the shimmering heat waves. They didn't fight standing battles. They fought a war of ghosts. they would strike a settlement, burn it, and vanish before the dust settled. The 10th Cavalry, led by Captain Nicholas Nolan, was tasked with running them down. It was a mission that required not just bravery, but insanity. The horses the army had given the black troopers were the dregs of the remount depots, animals that were often too old or too sick for the white regiments. Yet, the troopers treated these beasts with a reverence that bordered on worship. They knew that in the Llano, a man without a horse is a dead man. They groomed them until their coats shone like polished mahogany. They shared their own meager water rations with them. They turned these cast-off animals into endurance machines. But in July 1877, the Llano Estacado decided to test the 10th Cavalry in a way that bullets never could. It became known as the thirsting time, a nightmare that is still studied in military survival schools today. Captain Nolan led a detachment of 60 black troopers and a group of white buffalo hunters out onto the plains in pursuit of a band of Comanches who had been raiding settlements. The Comanches, led by the brilliant strategist Quanah Parker or his lieutenants, knew they couldn't beat the buffalo soldiers in a straight fight. So they used the land. They led Nolan's command deep into the driest, most desolate sector of the plains. They poisoned the few water holes with the carcasses of dead horses or simply drained them dry. They lured the soldiers into a trap made of nothing but heat and dust. For 86 hours, the buffalo soldiers did not have a drop of water. Imagine that. 3.5 days under a relentless July sun, wearing heavy wool uniforms designed for northern climates, carrying rifles and ammunition. The human body is not built for this. After the first day, the mouth goes dry. After the second, the tongue swells until it chokes the throat. The skin stops sweating because there is no moisture left to give. The blood thickens to sludge. The mind begins to crack. The white buffalo hunters, men who prided themselves on being the toughest frontiersmen in the West, began to break. They panicked. They rode off in random directions, chasing mirages of lakes that didn't exist. They abandoned discipline. They became animals. But the black troopers of the 10th Cavalry did not break. This is the moment that defines their legacy. As the dehydration set in, as men began to hallucinate, seeing rivers of ice water flowing over the dry grass, the discipline of the buffalo soldiers held them together. They didn't scatter. They stayed in formation. They obeyed orders. Why? Because their entire lives had been a training ground for suffering. They had endured the Middle Passage in their genetic memory. They had endured the lash of the overseer. They had endured the starvation of the sharecropper's cabin. A little thirst wasn't going to dismantle them, but the desperation was real. As the horses began to die, the men were forced to do the unthinkable. To survive, they cut the ears of their dying mounts to suck the blood. It was a thick, clotted, hot liquid that did little to quench their thirst, but it kept them alive. Some men drank their own urine, sweetened with brown sugar from their saddlebags to make it palatable. They chewed on bullets to keep the saliva flowing. Captain Nolan, a white Irishman who had faced his own persecution, watched his men with awe. He saw them helping each other. When a trooper fell from his saddle, too weak to rise, 2 others would dismount and lift him back up. They refused to leave a man behind. In the midst of a biological breakdown, they maintained a brotherhood that defied the laws of survival of the fittest. Eventually, the expedition stumbled back to a known water source, Double Lakes. The horses smelled the water miles before the men saw it. The animals broke into a run. When the troopers reached the water, they didn't care about rank or dignity. They threw themselves face first into the mud, drinking alongside the horses, soaking their parched skin. They had survived the thirsting time. They hadn't caught the Comanches that week, but they had won a different kind of victory. They had proven that they could survive the worst the American West could throw at them. They had proven that their discipline was superior to that of the white frontiersmen who had scattered and died. But survival on the plains was only half the battle. When the Buffalo Soldiers rode back into the towns they were protecting, towns in Texas like San Angelo or Fort Concho, they faced a different kind of hostility. The tragedy of the Buffalo Soldier is that he was a guardian for a people who despised him. These men patrolled the perimeter of white civilization. They stopped the raids. They made the roads safe for the stagecoaches carrying white women and children. They strung the telegraph wire that allowed white businessmen to communicate. But when they dusted off their uniforms and walked into a saloon for a beer, they were met with signs that read, "No niggers or dogs allowed." There were shootouts, not with Indians, but with white civilians. In Texas, a Buffalo Soldier named Trooper Watkins was murdered in a saloon by a white local. When his comrades came to investigate, the town sheriff arrested them. The tension was constant. The soldiers had to be perfect. A white soldier could get drunk and start a brawl, and it would be boys being boys. A black soldier who raised his voice was a mutineer or a threat to white womanhood. Yet they stayed. The re-enlistment rates for the 9th and 10th Cavalry were the highest in the Army. Why? Because the Army, with all its flaws, was the only place in America where a black man could hold his head up. As the years passed, and the 1870s turned into the 1880s, the war against the Comanches ended, and the war against the Apaches began. This was a different kind of war. The Apaches, led by legends like Victorio and Geronimo, were mountain fighters. They lived in the jagged, rock-strewn terrain of New Mexico and Arizona. They were arguably the toughest guerrilla fighters the world has ever seen. The Army sent the Buffalo Soldiers to catch them. The 9th and 10th Cavalry spent years in the saddle, tracking Geronimo. They climbed mountains where the air was so thin it made their lungs burn. They earned the grudging respect of the Apache. The name Buffalo Soldier spread among the tribes. It became a totem. The Apache knew that if the white cavalry was chasing them, they could probably outrun them or trick them. But if the buffaloes were on their trail, they had to keep moving. The Buffalo Soldiers didn't stop. They didn't quit. They had the stamina of the very animal they were named after. By 1898, the Indian Wars were fading into history. The frontier was officially closed. The Buffalo Soldiers of the 9th and 10th Cavalry had spent 30 years in the saddle. They were no longer the ragtag experiment of 1866. They were the most combat-hardened, disciplined, and professional units in the United States Army. They had gray in their beards and scars on their skin. They were the old guard. But America was restless. The nation was looking outward, eyeing the crumbling Spanish Empire in the Caribbean. When the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, the cry for war was instantaneous. Remember the Maine? To hell with Spain. The United States mobilized for its first overseas conflict, and for the first time, the Buffalo Soldiers were called upon to fight a conventional war against a European power. They were ordered to leave the deserts of Arizona and Montana and assemble in Tampa, Florida, for the invasion of Cuba. The journey to the war was a war in itself. As the trains carrying the black regiments rolled through the Deep South, the soldiers were met not with cheers, but with hatred. In Texas and Alabama, they were forced to sit in segregated cars. They were denied service at train station depots. In Lakeland, Florida, a white druggist refused to sell a soda to a black trooper. The tension exploded. The Buffalo Soldiers, armed and tired of being treated like dogs, rioted. They smashed the drugstore. They challenged the local white mobs. It was a stark reminder. They were willing to die for the stars and stripes, but they weren't going to be disrespected by the people living under it. When they landed in Cuba, the Buffalo Soldiers found themselves in an environment that tested them in new ways. Gone were the open plains where they could maneuver. This was a jungle. It was a green hell of vines, humidity, and yellow fever, and waiting for them were the Spanish, armed with Mauser rifles. The campaign centered on the city of Santiago. To take the city, the Americans had to capture the high ground, a ridgeline known as the San Juan Heights. Here enters the myth. If you open a standard history book or watch a movie from the 1950s, you will be told that the Battle of San Juan Hill was won by the Rough Riders, a volunteer regiment of cowboys and college athletes led by the charismatic, spectacle-wearing Theodore Roosevelt. The story goes that Teddy, with a bandana around his hat and a pistol in his hand, charged up the hill alone, leading his men to a glorious victory, while the rest of the army watched in awe. It is a fantastic story. It is also a lie. The reality of July 1st, 1898, was chaos. The American forces were pinned down at the bottom of the heights. The Spanish were raining down a withering fire from their trenches on top of Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill. The heat was unbearable. Men were dropping from heat stroke as fast as they were dropping from bullets. The Rough Riders, for all their enthusiasm, were amateurs. They were stuck. They were taking heavy casualties. They were on the verge of being wiped out. General Fighting Joe Wheeler, a former Confederate general now serving the U.S., needed his best troops to break the deadlock. He sent in the Buffalo Soldiers. The 9th and 10th Cavalry moved up through the jungle. They didn't charge in a reckless, screaming wave like in the movies. They advanced with the cold professionalism of veterans. They used a tactic called rushes, small groups moving forward while others laid down suppressing fire. They cut the barbed wire fences that trapped the white units. They moved through the Rough Riders. One white officer, seeing the black troops advancing calmly under fire while his own men were panicked, wrote, "They were the bravest men I have ever seen." The defining image of the battle should not be Teddy Roosevelt on a horse. It should be Color Sergeant George Berry of the 10th Cavalry. As the Buffalo Soldiers surged up the hill, the standard bearer of the White 3rd Cavalry fell, dropping his regiment's flag in the dirt. Sergeant Berry saw it. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the White Regiment's flag in one hand and his own 10th Cavalry flag in the other. Picture that. A black man, under a hail of Mauser bullets, running up a sheer incline, carrying the colors of 2 regiments, leading the charge that saved the day. He shouted, "Dress on the colors, boys," and the men followed him into the Spanish trenches. They took the hill. On top of Kettle Hill, Theodore Roosevelt found himself surrounded, not just by his Rough Riders, but by the men of the 9th and 10th Cavalry. He was breathless. He was alive. And he knew why. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, amidst the smoke and the bodies, Roosevelt was effusive. He shook the hands of the black sergeants. He wrote in his initial reports that the Buffalo Soldiers had saved his life. He said, "No troops could have behaved better." But the window of gratitude slammed shut very quickly. As Roosevelt began his political ascent, aiming for the White House, the narrative changed. He couldn't be the hero who was saved by black troops. That wouldn't sell in the segregated America of 1900. He needed to be the lone savior. So he rewrote the story. In his memoirs, published later, Roosevelt diminished the role of the Buffalo Soldiers. He claimed that during the battle, he had to draw his revolver to stop black soldiers from retreating. He called them shirkers. It was a betrayal of Shakespearean proportions. The men who had bled for him were slandered by him to boost his own ego. The legend of the Rough Riders grew, and the legend of the Buffalo Soldiers was buried under a pile of racist revisionism. If the American West was a forge that hardened the Buffalo Soldiers, the Philippine Islands were the acid that tested the very metal of their souls. In 1899, the United States found itself in possession of a new empire. Spain was gone, but the Filipino people, led by the revolutionary Emilio Aguinaldo, had declared their independence. They didn't want a new master. They wanted freedom. The U.S. government called it an insurrection. The soldiers on the ground called it a nigger fighting war. That was the terminology used by the white commanders and the white press. They referred to the Filipinos using the same racial slurs they used for African Americans. For the men of the 24th and 25th Infantry, marching through the steaming, leech-infested jungles of Luzon, the parallel was impossible to ignore. They looked at the dark-skinned villagers they were burning out of their huts, and they saw their own families in Georgia and Alabama. The Filipinos knew this, and they weaponized it. In a brilliant campaign of psychological warfare, the insurgents printed posters addressed specifically to the colored American soldier. "Why do you fight for the white man?" the leaflets read. "He treats you like a slave. He lynches you at home. He forces you to ride in the back of the train. We are your brothers. We share the same skin. We share the same struggle against the white imperialist. Come to us. We will give you rank. We will give you land. We will give you a white wife." Imagine the impact of those words on a soldier who has just spent 30 years serving a country that refuses to let him vote. The cognitive dissonance was deafening. Most of the Buffalo soldiers stayed loyal. Their discipline was ironclad. But there were men who looked at the equation and decided the math didn't add up. There were men who decided that loyalty to their race outweighed loyalty to their flag. The most famous of them was Corporal David Fagan. David Fagan was a soldier in the 24th Infantry. He was born in Tampa, Florida, the son of former slaves. He was tough, intelligent, and seemingly a good soldier. But something snapped in the jungle. Perhaps it was seeing a white officer torture a Filipino prisoner. Perhaps it was just the relentless, grinding racism of the army. On November 17th, 1899, Fagan walked away. He took his Krag-Jurgensen rifle, his ammunition belt, and his knowledge of American tactics, and he vanished into the green wall of the jungle. He didn't just run away to hide. He went to the Filipino headquarters. He offered his services, and they made him a captain. This was the U.S. Army's worst nightmare realized. A black soldier, trained by the government, leading an enemy force against white troops. Fagan became a legend and a ghost. He taught the Filipino guerrillas how to ambush American columns. He taught them how to use the terrain. He led raids that were terrifying in their efficiency. Reports filtered back to the American lines. Captain Fagan was hunting his former officers. He became a bogeyman. The Army became obsessed with him. They put a bounty on Fagan's head. $600, a massive sum. They wanted him dead, not just because he was effective, but because he was a symbol. If Fagan succeeded, if other black soldiers followed him, the entire segregated structure of the U.S. military could collapse from within. Fagan taunted them. He left notes. He waged a personal war against the United States. In 1901, the war began to wind down. The insurrection was broken. But David Fagan was still out there. The Army increased the pressure. In December 1901, a Filipino hunter walked into an American outpost carrying a sack. Inside was a decomposing head. He claimed it was Fagan. He demanded the reward. The officers looked at the head. It was black. It was decomposed. It was impossible to positively identify. But the Army was desperate to close the book. They declared Fagan dead. They paid the bounty. They wanted the ghost exorcised. But in the villages, the story was different. The locals said Fagan wasn't dead. They said he had married a Filipino woman and disappeared into the deep mountains, living out his days in peace, laughing at the white man's army one last time. For the Buffalo soldiers who stayed loyal, the end of the war brought them back to the United States. And what did they find? They found that while they were fighting in the jungle, the situation at home had gotten worse. The Plessy versus Ferguson decision of 1896 had codified separate but equal into the law of the land. Lynchings were at an all-time high. this tension exploded in Brownsville, Texas in 1906. The Brownsville affair is the tragic coda to the Buffalo Soldier era. It is the moment where the government finally turned its back on them completely. The 25th Infantry was stationed at Fort Brown. The local white population hated them. On the night of August 13th, shots were fired in the town. The townspeople immediately blamed the soldiers. The soldiers denied it. The evidence was flimsy. Spent cartridges planted at the scene that didn't match the firing records. It was a frame-up. President Theodore Roosevelt, the man who had praised the Buffalo Soldiers in Cuba only to slander them in his book, saw an opportunity to look tough. Without a trial, without a hearing, without due process, he issued an executive order. He dishonorably discharged 167 men of the 25th Infantry Regiment. Among them were sergeants with 20 years of service, men who had fought the Apache, men who had charged up San Juan Hill. They were stripped of their pensions. They were stripped of their dignity. They were kicked out of the army they had given their lives to, based on a lie. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, the United States Army was looking for a way to replace the horse. The animal that had conquered the West was expensive. It needed water, and it could be killed by disease. The brass in Washington looked at the new invention sweeping the nation, the bicycle, and wondered, could this be the future of warfare? They needed a unit to test this theory. Naturally, they chose the Buffalo Soldiers. In 1897, the 25th Infantry Bicycle Corps was formed at Fort Missoula, Montana. It was known as the Iron Riders. This sounds like a quirky footnote, but do not underestimate what these men did. They were ordered to ride from Missoula, Montana, to St. Louis, Missouri. That is 1,100 miles. They didn't have paved roads. They didn't have suspension. They rode 100-pound bicycles loaded with rifles, ammunition, and tents over the Rocky Mountains. They arrived in St. Louis in spectacular formation, proving that the black soldier could master any machine and endure any hardship. But the reception they received in St. Louis was a foreshadowing of the horror to come. They were denied entry to restaurants. They were segregated. This tension, the gap between their elite performance and their subhuman treatment, was a powder keg. And in 1917, in the sweltering heat of Houston, Texas, the keg finally exploded. The story of the Camp Logan Mutiny, or the Houston Riot, is the darkest chapter in the history of the Buffalo Soldiers. It is the moment when the loyal guardians of the frontier finally had enough. The 3rd Battalion of the 24th Infantry Regiment was sent to Houston. Houston in 1917 was a Jim Crow stronghold. The local white police force was notoriously brutal. They harassed the soldiers constantly. On August 23, 1917, Corporal Charles Baltimore, a highly respected MP from the regiment, was pistol-whipped by police and shot at. Back at the camp, a rumor spread like wildfire. The police have killed Corporal Baltimore, and they are coming for us next. The soldiers of the 24th Infantry made a fateful decision. They were not going to die like rats in a trap. They broke into the supply tents. They grabbed their Springfield rifles. Over 150 Buffalo soldiers marched out of Camp Logan in a column of twos, heading toward the police station in downtown Houston. They were going to war, not against the Germans, against the Houston Police Department. For 2 hours, the streets of Houston became a battlefield. The Buffalo soldiers moved with tactical precision. They fought police cars. They fought white civilians who shot at them. It was a release of 50 years of pent-up rage. The reaction of the United States government was swift, terrified, and vengeful. The entire battalion was disarmed. Then came the trials. The court-martial of the 24th Infantry soldiers was the largest murder trial in American military history. It was a kangaroo court. On December 11th, 1917, 13 soldiers were sentenced to death by hanging. The army carried out the executions immediately, in total secrecy, before the review process was even complete. At dawn on December 11th, near Salado Creek in San Antonio, the 13 condemned Buffalo soldiers were marched to the gallows. They didn't beg. They didn't cry. Witnesses reported that the men stood tall. As the nooses were placed around their necks, they began to sing, "Lord, I'm coming home." Then the trapdoors opened. It was a lynching under the guise of military justice. The Houston riot broke the back of the Buffalo Soldier legend in the eyes of the white establishment. Before 1917, the black regulars were seen as safe. After Houston, they were seen as a threat. This is the direct reason why the Buffalo Soldiers were sidelined in World War I. The generals looked at Houston and said, "We cannot trust them in France." By the 1920s and 30s, the United States Army was falling in love with the combustion engine. The tank and the truck were the new gods of war. The horse was becoming a relic, and the men who rode them, the Buffalo Soldiers, were becoming an embarrassment. The Army decided to break them. They turned the elite warriors of the frontier into servants. The 10th Cavalry was split up and sent to West Point to be dog robbers, glorified stable boys for white cadets. When Pearl Harbor was bombed in 1941, a flicker of hope ignited. The 9th and 10th Cavalry were reorganized into the 2nd Cavalry Division. They were shipped to North Africa in 1944, and then the order came down. The Army decided that there was no use for a black cavalry division. Without firing a single shot at the Nazis, the 2nd Cavalry Division was deactivated. The men were ordered to turn in their weapons and surrender their horses. They were handed shovels and pickaxes. Veterans of the unit described the scene with tears in their eyes. Grown men weeping as they were stripped of their identity. But while the original horse regiments were being dismantled, the symbol of the Buffalo Soldier was being resurrected in a new form. The Army formed the 92nd Infantry Division for combat in Europe. They gave them a shoulder patch featuring a black buffalo. The commander was General Edward Almond, a virulent racist who believed black troops were inferior. He threw them against the Gothic line in Italy, a nightmare of German bunkers in the mountains. But on the ground, the reality was different. There were men in the 92nd who fought with the ferocity of lions. The greatest of them was Lieutenant Vernon Baker. On April 5th, 1945, Baker's company was ordered to assault Castle Aginolfi. It was a suicide mission. The white captain vanished. Baker was left alone with 25 men. He didn't retreat. He crawled forward. He waged a one-man war against the castle. He destroyed 3 machine gun positions, an observation post, and a dugout. He killed 9 German soldiers with his own hands. He covered the evacuation of his wounded men. He was the last man off the hill. Vernon Baker was recommended for the Medal of Honor. But he was a black officer. The paperwork was lost. He received a Distinguished Service Cross. But the stain of General Almond's racism lingered. The failure of the 92nd became a talking point against integration, but they couldn't stop the clock. In 1948, President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981, desegregating the military. It was the death knell of the Buffalo Soldiers as a segregated concept. It wasn't until the Korean War in 1950 that the integration truly happened, and it happened in blood. The 24th Infantry Regiment, the same regiment that had mutinied in Houston, was sent to Korea. In the opening days of the war, the 24th scored the first major victory for the UN forces at the city of Yecheon. They took the town. They held the line. But history repeated itself. White officers blamed the 24th for the overall American collapse, accusing them of bug-out fever. Finally, in 1951, the 24th Infantry was formally disbanded. Its colors were furled. The men were distributed into white units. It was the end of the line. After 85 years, the era of the Buffalo Soldier was officially over. When the colors of the last segregated regiment were furled in 1951, a silence fell over the legacy of the Buffalo Soldiers. They were stranded in history. But a legend written in blood is impossible to erase completely. It just waits for the right voice to sing it back to life. In 1983, that voice came from the unlikeliest of places, Jamaica. Bob Marley released Buffalo Soldier. Stolen from Africa, brought to America, fighting on arrival, fighting for survival. Marley wasn't just writing a catchy tune, he was writing a history lesson. He recognized what American textbooks had ignored, that the Buffalo Soldier was the ultimate symbol of the black diaspora's resilience. The song put the name Buffalo Soldier on the lips of millions of people around the world. But while Marley gave them a song, it took a 4-star general to give them a sanctuary. General Colin Powell, who famously said, "I dreamed of the Buffalo Soldiers. I felt their presence," dedicated a massive monument at Fort Leavenworth in 1992. It was an apology in bronze. It was America finally saying, "We see you." But the legacy of the Buffalo Soldiers is not just static metal. It is living, breathing, and roaring down the highway. If you drive the interstates of America today, you might see a group of motorcycle riders wearing yellow and black vests, with a patch on their backs depicting a buffalo and crossed sabers. They are the National Association of Buffalo Soldiers and Troopers Motorcycle Club. There are thousands of them. They ride to keep the history alive. They have traded the horse for the Harley, but the spirit is identical. So, what is the final verdict on the Buffalo Soldiers? It is complicated. History is not a fairy tale. We cannot ignore the fact that they were the enforcers of a brutal expansionist policy against Native Americans. But we must also judge them by the context of their time. In a world that offered the black man nothing but the lynching tree or the sharecropper's shack, the Buffalo Soldiers chose dignity. They proved that citizenship is not a gift, it is a purchase. They bought their share of America with $13 a month and a life in the saddle. They built the roads we drive on. They strung the wires that connected the coasts. They protected the parks where we vacation. They are the fathers of the American West. Without them, the map of the United States looks different. Without them, the history of the civil rights movement looks different. They were the first to integrate the federal service. They were the first to show that a black man with a gun was not a threat to the Republic, but its greatest defender. As we close this chapter, I want you to picture one last scene. It is sunset in the Arizona desert. The air is cooling down. A patrol of the 10th Cavalry is riding back to the fort. They are covered in white dust. Their horses are tired. The men are silent, exhausted. But look at the sergeant at the front. Look at how he sits. His back is straight. His hat is tilted just so. His eyes are scanning the horizon. He is not a victim. He is a master of his environment. He owns this land because he has bled into it. He is the Buffalo Soldier, and he is riding into eternity. This story is your inheritance. The books tried to hide them. The movies tried to replace them. But the truth is a stubborn thing. Now, the mission is yours. The algorithm of the internet is just like the history books of the 19th century. It favors the comfortable lie over the difficult truth. Do not move on. If this story made you feel something, pride, anger, sorrow, or awe, you have a duty. You are now a trooper in the regiment of memory. Share this video. Send it to your father. Send it to your son. Send it to the teacher who taught you about the Rough Riders but forgot the Buffalo Soldiers. Post it on your timeline. Force the world to look at these men. And finally, I have one last request. A final roll call for the men who rode into the sunset and never came back. The motto of the 10th Cavalry was simple. It was two words that summed up their entire existence. When asked to do the impossible, when asked to ride into the fire, they didn't complain. They didn't ask why. They simply said, ready and forward. Go to the comments right now. I want you to type those words. A salute across time. Type, ready and forward. Let's build a wall of text that no wind can blow away. Let's show the Buffalo Soldiers that their ride was not in vain. Troopers of the 9th and 10th, you are relieved. The watch is ours. Thank you for watching. Keep your powder dry, keep your head up, and always ride forward.